You know, usually when we talk about medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of, like, total precision.
Right, like it's a math equation or something.
Exactly. Like engineering. You
Yeah.
break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points at it and says, there it is.
Yeah, it's broken or it's not broken. Very clean.
Right. It's
Yeah.
binary. It's visible. But step into the world of child trauma, and that x-ray machine just completely shatters.
Oh, absolutely. The entire landscape becomes incredibly murky.
Yeah. And as a 1993 study by Marla P. Peterson really proves, our attempts to fix this issue well, they might actually be harming the kids we're trying to save.
It's a really tough reality to face.
It is. And to you listening right now, I just want to acknowledge right up front that, we are diving into something incredibly challenging today.
We are.
We're looking at the prevalence, the psychology, and the prevention of physical and sexual abuse among school children.
And it's a profound responsibility to examine this. I mean, to do it effectively, we really have to look at what the actual data tells us, right? Not just what our protective instincts tell us.
Exactly, because our instincts can be wrong. And the source material we're working with today is Peterson's really comprehensive review that was published in the Educational Psychology Review.
Yeah, and the mission of this deep dive, the reason we're doing this, is to look past that surface-level panic we all feel.
Right. We have to dig into the hard data. We need to understand what abuse actually looks like, who commits it, and maybe most shockingly, why those school-based prevention programs we all thought were keeping kids safe.
The assemblies we all went through.
Yes. Why they might actually be doing the exact opposite, built on, zero evidence.
I think it's crucial, though, to set the context for this data right away.
Yeah, please do.
So Peterson's review synthesizes studies from the 1980s and the early 1990s. But the psychological mechanisms she uncovers, like the systemic challenges in identifying abuse and the neurological ways humans process trauma, those are completely timeless.
They don't expire.
Exactly. The cognitive barriers we're going to explore, they're playing out in classrooms at this very moment.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we can even look at the statistics of who is actually getting hurt, we have to understand the language we're using.
Right, the definitions.
Yeah, it seems like one of the biggest hurdles Peterson identifies right off the bat is just defining the terms. Because in everyday conversation, we just, toss around words like abuse and neglect interchangeably.
We do. We treat them like synonyms.
Right. But legally and clinically, they are entirely different universes.
They really are, and that distinction is vital for how systems actually respond. So Peterson relies on a framework drawn from earlier clinical work that divides child maltreatment into two very rigid, distinct categories.
Okay.
Acts of commission and acts of omission.
Okay, so an act of commission. That sounds active. Like that is an adult actively doing something harmful to a child.
Correct.
And that's what we classify as abuse, right?
Exactly. It's the overt infliction of injury or trauma.
Right. And under that umbrella of commission, you have physical abuse, which is, the overt infliction of bodily injury, shaking, beating, burning, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And then you have sexual abuse, which covers just this massive, devastating spectrum from inappropriate exposure all the way to incest.
Yes, unfortunately.
But then there's emotional abuse. That's still commission, right?
Mm.
Like an active attack on a child's psychological development.
It is, yeah. And emotional abuse is often way harder to quantify, but it's incredibly destructive.
What does that look like in practice?
Well, it involves things like using terror tactics to keep a child quiet or locking a child in a confined space as a punishment.
Wow.
Or placing impossible, degrading demands on them. The key is that the adult is actively choosing to inflict psychological pain.
Active choice.
Right.
And that stands in total contrast to the second category, which is acts of omission.
Yes.
This is neglect. This isn't about actively attacking the child, right? It's about a complete failure to provide what a child fundamentally needs to survive.
Omission is all about the void. It's what's missing. So physical neglect is the most commonly recognized, failing to provide food, basic shelter, or supervision.
Just leaving them alone.
Right. Abandonment is the extreme, catastrophic end of that spectrum. And then medical neglect is failing or refusing to treat severe illnesses.
Okay.
But the forms of neglect that are most pervasive in the school environment are actually emotional and educational neglect.
And those are the ones that feel so invisible to me. I mean, if I'm understanding the source correctly, emotional neglect isn't just like a parent ignoring a child who wants to play a game.
No, it's much more severe than that.
Right. It can mean a parent tolerating serious, dangerous misconduct, Like knowing your teenager is heavily abusing drugs or committing assaults, and you do nothing.
Exactly. Or a school desperately recommending mental health services for a child who is clearly in crisis, and the parent just refuses to engage.
They just check out.
It is the total abdication of the parental role. And educational neglect functions the exact same way.
Like skipping school.
Well, not just a kid skipping school once. It's chronic truancy that the parent completely ignores. Or failing to enroll a child in school entirely.
Wait, completely failing to enroll them?
Yeah, or refusing remedial educational services without any valid reason at all. The adult basically fails to ensure the child can acquire the basic skills they need to function in society.
So we have these two massive buckets, right? Commission, which is abuse, and omission, which is neglect.
Yes.
And defining these terms isn't just some academic exercise. It completely changes the statistics.
Oh, dramatically.
Because if we're trying to measure how big this problem is, how you define maltreatment totally changes who gets counted. And Peterson walks us through these two massive data collection efforts by the government, National Incidence Studies.
Right, the NIS studies. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services undertook these to get a true picture of the crisis.
Because they knew they were flying blind.
Exactly. So there was NIS-1, which was completed in 1980, and then a follow-up, NIS-2, completed in 1986.
And the scale of these studies is just wild to me. They didn't just sit back and look at cases reported to Child Protective Services, did they?
No, because they knew kids were slipping through the cracks. CPS only sees a fraction of the reality.
Right, so they surveyed this national probability sample of 29 counties, and they actively polled schools, police departments, hospitals, public health personnel.
Basically anyone who interacts with kids.
Yeah, to find the kids who were known to the community, but maybe not to CPS.
They cast a very, very wide net to capture that unrecorded reality. But the data they published in 1986 is where things get incredibly complicated.
How so?
Well, for NIS-2, the researchers didn't just use one definition to count the cases. They used two entirely different definitional standards.
Oh boy, okay. Let's start with the first one then, the core estimate. This was the exact same standard they used back in 1980, right?
Yes. The requirement here was demonstrable harm. Meaning, for a child to be counted in these statistics, there had to be physical or clinical proof that the child was actively, visibly harmed by the maltreatment.
Okay, so a bruise, a broken bone, severe malnutrition.
Exactly. Demonstrable. And using that strict core definition, numbers absolutely exploded between 1980 and 1986.
Like how much?
Under the exact same criteria, they estimated over 1 million children nationwide experienced abuse or neglect in 1986.
Wow.
Yeah, that represented a 66% increase in countable cases in just a 6-year window.
A 66% increase in 6 years. That is a staggering jump.
It's massive.
And the breakdown is terrifying too. Physical abuse jumped by 58%. Moderate injuries almost doubled. Neglect and emotional abuse stayed roughly the same, but the rate of sexual abuse, it more than tripled its 1980 rate.
Tripled. But we have to look at the second definition they applied to that 1986 data.
Okay, the revised estimate.
Right, because between 1980 and 1986, the laws had changed. The legal understanding of child protection expanded to include children who were threatened with harm, not just those who had already suffered it.
Ah, so preventive.
Yes. So the researchers created this revised estimate, and this definition didn't just count kids who suffered demonstrable harm. It included kids who were endangered or placed at risk of harm.
And this is where that X-ray analogy from earlier really falls apart.
Completely.
Because the moment you change the definition from broken bone to might break a bone in the future, the numbers just mutate entirely.
What's fascinating here is how a bureaucratic shift in language alters our entire perception of a crisis.
Yeah.
By moving the goalpost from demonstrable harm to endangered, the researchers suddenly added over 500,000 children to the national statistics.
Over 500,000.
Yes, the estimate leaped from roughly 1 million kids to over 1.5 million kids nationwide.
Just because of a word change. And the internal ratios flipped, too. Under this new, broader definition, neglect suddenly made up the vast majority of cases, like 63%.
Right, because risk of harm heavily involves neglect.
Exactly. And abuse dropped to 43% of the total pie. It reshapes the entire landscape of what we think is happening.
It really does.
But, regardless of which definition you use, Peterson lays out some very specific demographic findings from this data that I think are crucial.
Definitely.
First off, gender. Under the core definition, females were sexually abused almost 4 times as often as males.
And that is a statistic we are going to dissect heavily when we talk about symptomatology later.
Oh, for sure.
Because there are incredibly complex psychological layers to how those numbers are reported.
I can't wait to get to that. Then there's age. Physical abuse was actually less common for infants aged 0 to 2, and toddlers aged 3 to 5 were abused less than kids aged 12 and over.
Which surprises some people.
Yeah. But tragically, the younger kids suffered the most fatalities, while the older kids suffered more of the moderate injuries.
Which is just a grim physiological reality. I mean, a teenager has the physical mass and resilience to survive a physical assault that would easily be fatal to an infant or a toddler.
That's incredibly dark, but logically it makes sense. Then we hit the economic factors. The 1980s data defined lower-income families as those making under $15,000 a year.
Right.
And children from those lower-income brackets experienced both physical and sexual abuse at 4 times the rate of children from higher-income families.
4 times the rate.
And family size was a huge factor, too. Families with 4 or more kids had significantly higher rates of physical abuse than smaller families.
Yeah.
But, and I think this is a vital point to highlight for anyone listening, the study found absolutely no significant statistical relationship between maltreatment and a child's race or ethnicity.
Right. The heavy correlations with income and family size point directly toward environmental stress. And that is a major component we'll need to analyze when we look at the psychological makeup of an abuser. But before we get there, we really need to confront the elephant in the room regarding that initial statistic.
You mean the massive 66% increase from 1980 to 1986?
Yes. Because Peterson points out that the corporate authors of the NIS2 study put forward a very specific theory about that spike.
Right. They suggested that this huge jump wasn't necessarily because actual incidents of abuse were exploding at unprecedented epidemic rates.
Exactly. They theorized it was likely due to an increase in the recognition and the reporting of child maltreatment by community professionals.
So we were just getting better at catching it.
Yeah, you have to consider the cultural context of the 1980s. Awareness campaigns were saturating the media. For the very first time, teachers, pediatricians, police officers, they were receiving mandated training on what to look for.
The warning signs.
Right. The study's authors essentially argued that the abuse had always been there, hidden in the dark, and society had just finally turned the lights on.
Okay, I hear that, but I really have to push back on that a bit.
Go ahead.
I really question the validity of relying on these numbers as like an absolute truth of the situation.
Why is that?
Because if the definitions of what counts as abuse keep fluctuating from harm to endangered, and at the exact same time, the awareness and training of the professionals doing the reporting is drastically shifting, aren't we just looking at a moving target?
It's a valid point.
Think about it like trying to measure the exact size of a room, but your ruler is made of elastic and the person holding the ruler keeps changing the unit of measurement.
That's a great analogy.
How can we trust any demographic trends like the massive income disparity or the gender gap if the reporting itself is biased by who the professionals are watching most closely?
Right, the surveillance aspect.
Yeah. If a social worker or a teacher has been subconsciously trained by society to pay more attention to a poor family with 5 kids than a wealthy family with 2 kids, won't the data naturally skew that way?
That is a highly sophisticated critique, and it really strikes at the heart of the persistent dilemma in sociological data collection.
We only know what we count.
Exactly. We only know what we can count, and we only count what we are trained to see. Surveillance bias is a very real phenomenon. If you only put cameras in one neighborhood, well, that's the only neighborhood where you'll catch speeding cars.
Exactly.
And Peterson herself acknowledges the inherent constraints of this data collection. However, even if reporting bias accounts for some of the demographic skews or the sheer volume of the increase, we cannot ignore the baseline here.
Because over 1 million kids.
Over 1 million children facing demonstrable physical harm. That tells us we are dealing with a systemic, profound crisis, regardless of the elastic ruler.
Yeah, that's undeniably true.
The macro-level spreadsheets give us the scope, but to truly understand it, we have to zoom in.
Which is exactly what this review does. It takes us from the macro data of these huge government surveys to the micro level. What does this actually look like when a child walks into a classroom or, when they're sitting in their own living room?
Right.
And that takes us into the physical scars and the deeply entrenched cycle of violence.
Because when a child is facing physical abuse, The indicators that educators and doctors are trained to look for often go far beyond the obvious injuries.
Yeah, the source outlines the physical symptoms pretty clearly. The bruises, broken bones, puncture marks, cigarette burns.
Awful to even think about.
It is.
Yep.
And the biggest red flag is injuries in various stages of healing, right? Because that proves this isn't just a one-off accident on the monkey bars. It's a pattern.
Yes, a sustained pattern of trauma.
But what I found incredibly illuminating were the behavioral attempts by the parents to hide the abuse.
Cover-ups.
Yeah, a child might have habitual lateness or these unexplained absences from school because the parent is literally keeping the kid locked at home until the visible marks fade.
It's calculated.
Completely. Or the child will offer these bizarre, physically impossible explanations for how they got hurt, clearly reciting a script they were forced to memorize.
And beyond the physical attempts to hide the trauma, there is a profound psychological adaptation occurring within the child.
How so?
Well, Peterson cites Cohn's 1991 work, which observed that physically abused children often polarize into one of two starkly different personality patterns.
Oh, the two extremes.
Yes. On one end of the spectrum, you have the child who becomes hyper-compliant. They are shy, passive, withdrawn, and intensely uncommunicative.
They just shut down.
They are desperately trying to make themselves invisible. They genuinely believe that if they take up no space and make no noise, they won't trigger the violence.
Just blending into the wallpaper. And what happens on the other extreme of that polarization?
On the other side, the child becomes nervous, hyperactive, aggressive, disruptive, and destructive.
Almost the exact opposite.
Entirely. They have internalized the chaos of their home environment, and they are projecting it outward into the classroom. They have learned that interactions are inherently aggressive, so they strike first.
Which brings us to a really, really difficult question.
Who is doing this?
Exactly. What makes a parent physically abuse their own child? To answer this, Peterson brings in research from two major studies, Strauss and Cantor in 1987 and Justice and Justice in 1990.
Right.
And I love this part of the deep dive because their findings completely shatter a very common, very pervasive myth in our culture.
The stress myth.
Yes, the myth is that poverty, or high environmental stress, just inherently causes people to snap. We tell ourselves this story that if someone loses their job and can't pay the rent, the stress just naturally boils over into violence against their kids.
But the data says that is false.
Completely false. Stress alone does not cause abuse.
That is a vital paradigm-shifting distinction. I mean, Strauss and Cantor looked at a nationally representative sample of over 1,000 parents.
A huge sample size.
Yes. And they found parents who were under massive, crushing amounts of stress, financial ruin, job loss, marital strife, but who did not abuse their children. Wow. And they found parents under the exact same amount of measurable stress who did abuse their children.
So what was the difference?
The differentiating factor was not the volume of stress. It was how the parents were, as the researchers termed it, socially scripted.
Socially scripted, meaning they were taught a script. They learned how to perform this violent behavior.
Precisely. The parents who were most likely to respond to a stressful event with physical violence were those who had observed their own fathers hitting their mothers, or who had been severely physically punished by their fathers themselves.
It's learned.
It is entirely learned. They had internalized a fundamental subconscious belief system that physical violence is an appropriate, legitimate, and effective way to solve problems or express frustration or assert control.
It is the cycle of violence, just perfectly mapped out in the data. They didn't invent the violence, they inherited it.
Yes.
Now, the researchers did find other correlating factors, right? Education by itself didn't stop abuse, but a toxic combination of low income, low education, and low occupational status did significantly increase the risk.
Because it compounds the stress.
Right. But the factor that really jumped out to me was social isolation. Parents who were isolated, no community clubs, no church groups, no supportive networks of friends, they had much higher abuse rates.
Because they have no buffer.
Yeah. But then there's this really strange finding. Having a lot of relatives living nearby actually increased the stress and the abuse rates for some families.
Which seems counterintuitive, right?
Totally.
Until you factor in the family dynamics. Extended family can be a support system, sure, but it can also be a massive source of conflict, judgment, and financial strain.
Oh, absolutely. The Thanksgiving dinner effect, but all year round.
Exactly. And Justice and Justice expanded on this stress model by looking at what kind of specific stress triggers these socially scripted parents.
What did they find?
It wasn't usually everyday chronic stress. It was rapid, uncontrollable change. a prolonged life crisis where things are changing way too fast for the person to adapt.
So the pacing of the stress matters.
Right. That acts as the predisposing factor that lights the fuse. But the most revealing, and honestly the most disturbing part of the justice and justice research is the internal psychological dynamic they uncovered within the abusive marriage itself.
Oh, the competition for nurturance.
Yes, they call it the competition for nurturance.
Here's where it gets really interesting and honestly really tragic. Because when I read this concept of the competition for nurturance, it just blew my mind.
It's a profound concept.
According to the research, in these abusive households, the spouses are essentially fighting this cold war over who gets to be the dependent.
Right, who gets to be the child.
Yes, they both view themselves as lifelong victims, losers in the battle for love, comfort, and care. So they fight with their spouse. They actively avoid adult responsibilities like paying bills or maintaining the home.
They create constant chaos.
Constant chaos, just to prove how helpless they are. And when the spouse refuses to coddle them because, the spouse is playing the exact same game, the loser of that dynamic turns to the child.
It is a devastating emotional pivot. The adult demands that the child become the emotional caretaker.
Right. It is a complete, terrifying role reversal. If I can use an analogy here, it's like a ship's captain who is terrified of a storm.
Okay.
Instead of taking the wheel and steering the ship, the captain demands that the child passengers navigate through the hurricane.
Wow.
And then, when the ship inevitably hits a reef, because they're kids, the captain violently punishes the children for failing.
That's exactly what's happening.
The adult demands that the child meet these impossible, entirely unrealistic emotional dependency needs.
Yeah.
And when the child acts like a child when they cry or need food or fail to parent the adult unleashes a lifetime of unhealed frustration and violence on them.
And we have to ask, what happens to a child's developing brain when the very person who is biologically supposed to nurture them becomes the source of pain and unreasonable demands?
It must short circuit.
It does. Peterson cites the work of Dr. Ray Helfer, a pediatrician who dedicated his life to studying battered children. Helfer observed a phenomenon he called profound sensory numbing.
The sensory shutdown. Explain how this works, because it sounds like a literal biological defense mechanism.
It is exactly that. Think about how a healthy infant or toddler learns about the world. They are little scientists, right?
Yeah, they touch everything, taste everything.
They listen, they look, they explore. But Helfer pointed out that for a physically abused child, that exploration is punished.
Right.
Touching a parent usually brings pain. The smells in the house, maybe alcohol or certain foods, are associated with terrifying, violent events. Making eye contact with an angry parent reveals the imminent threat of a strike. Listening closely means hearing screams, verbal abuse, and chaos. So, to survive this environment, the child's central nervous system learns a devastatingly logical lesson. It is far safer not to listen, not to look, and not to feel.
Using your senses only brings agony.
Exactly. Using your sensory inputs only brings pain.
So they're literally shutting down their own sensory receptors just to survive sitting in their own living room.
Yes.
It's like having an email spam folder that has been programmed by trauma. The brain decides that all incoming messages are viruses, so it just deletes everything before it even hits the inbox.
That's a very accurate way to picture it.
And Helfer noted something else that just breaks your heart. Because these children are taught that their feelings and their actions are the exact same thing because they are allowed zero agency or safe expression. They grow up believing they have absolutely no control over their own lives.
Learned helplessness.
Yes, they can't make decisions. They can't trust anyone, including themselves. So put yourself in the shoes of a teacher.
It's incredibly daunting.
How are you supposed to break through a child's sensory shutdown? If a child's brain is actively rejecting sensory input just to keep them alive, how do you teach them to read? How do you teach them math?
It is a monumental, almost insurmountable barrier if we don't recognize what's actually happening. It requires a complete paradigm shift in how we view educational readiness.
Absolutely.
And we will dive deeply into the cognitive processing aspect of that later, because right now we have to look at an even more complex presentation of trauma in the classroom.
Okay.
Because while physical abuse leaves bruises we can sometimes see, and behavioral shifts like hypercompliance that we can track, sexual abuse presents an entirely different, often masterfully hidden set of challenges for both the child and the school.
That is a perfect transition because unlike physical abuse, you rarely have a broken bone or a cigarette burn to point to.
Right. The physical evidence is often zero.
So Peterson lists the behavioral indicators that educators are trained to look for. And some of them were just generic stress responses, right? Like sudden, unexplained fears, chronic sleep problems, being highly distracted in class, depression, or suddenly withdrawing from friends.
But those can be caused by a divorce or a move or a learning disability.
Right, they're not specific.
Exactly. There are, however, specific indicators that are highly correlated almost exclusively with sexual abuse.
Right. The major red flag is age-inappropriate sexual language or actions, like a 5-year-old using explicit anatomical terminology or engaging in play with toys, pets, or peers that clearly mimics adult sexual acts.
Yes.
And Peterson cites Conti's 1986 work, which stresses a hard truth. Unless a child is severely, independently psychologically disturbed, this kind of highly specific choreographic behavioral knowledge almost always comes from actual experiential sexual contact with an older person.
They don't just invent these scenarios in a vacuum.
Right. They had to have seen it or experienced it.
And the long-term psychological fallout from this trauma is devastating. Peterson reviews David Finkelhor's 1990 update on the research here.
What does that show?
The legacy of this abuse includes chronic depression, profound self-destructive behavior, substance abuse, severe anxiety disorders, and tragically, a very strong tendency toward re-victimization later in life.
Being abused again.
Yes.
But within Finkelhor's review, there's a fascinating, highly nuanced breakdown of how this trauma affects boys versus girls.
This is such an important distinction.
Because for a long time, there was this assumption in the psychological community, and honestly in society at large, that boys just inherently deny their problems more than girls do.
The boys don't cry myth.
Exactly. That boys are taught to tough it out, repress their feelings, and hide their symptoms. But a 1987 study by Tong, Oates, and McDowell completely challenged that assumption.
This is a crucial piece of data regarding how adults perceive trauma. The researchers found that if you ask parents and teachers to evaluate the children, the adults will consistently rate the abused boys as being significantly less symptomatic than the abused girls.
So the adults think the boys are fine.
Right. The adults look at the boys and think, he's coping fine, he's bouncing back. But when the researchers asked the children to self-report their own symptoms, the boys reported experiencing just as many stress responses, fear levels, and sleep problems as the girls.
Wow, so the boys aren't denying it. They aren't toughing it out.
No, they are hurting just as much.
The adults around them just aren't seeing it. Or they are subconsciously refusing to take the boys' symptoms as seriously.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to look at the environmental context of the abuse itself. The data shows a stark, horrifying difference in where boys and girls are typically exposed.
Which is?
Girls are much more likely to be sexually abused inside the family or the extended family structure, incest. Boys, on the other hand, are statistically much more likely to be abused outside the family by someone in the community, like a neighbor, a coach, or a family friend.
And Finkelhor suggests this environmental difference might explain a lot about the reporting dynamics.
How so?
Think about it. If a boy is abused by someone outside the family, going to his parents to report his pain and his symptoms might be slightly less psychologically complex.
Because the parents are a safe haven.
Exactly. They are a refuge from the outside threat. But a girl trying to report symptoms caused by the very family members she lives with? The betrayal trauma is deeply intertwined with her daily survival.
That makes perfect sense. The psychological friction of disclosure is completely different. And Finkelhor raises a deeply unsettling question here. If boys are abused by family members, but they deny it completely because the cultural taboo surrounding male incest victims is so intensely strong, does that hidden, unacknowledged family abuse cause even more severe long-term pathologies for men?
That's a terrifying thought.
It is, and we actually see evidence of this divergence later in life. A study of college students who had survived childhood abuse showed that while both men and women suffered high rates of sleep disturbances, drug use, and low self-esteem, their primary psychological manifestations differed greatly.
The long-term effects. So the women in the college study trended heavily toward internalizing the pain, chronic depression.
Right.
But the men trended toward externalizing it. They expressed a desire to hurt others, or they expressed inappropriate sexual interest, particularly in children.
It's the cycle of abuse manifesting in real time.
Which makes identifying and stopping the abusers before they strike so incredibly critical.
Absolutely.
But Peterson points out a terrifying reality about the people who commit these acts.
You're talking about the complete lack of a reliable psychological profile.
Yes. As humans, we always want a boogeyman we can easily spot. We want a specific villain profile we can teach kids to, run away from
It
you.
makes us feel safe.
Yeah, right. But the research completely failed to find one. They used the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, the MMPI.
Let's clarify what that is because it's really important for context.
Please.
The MMPI is one of the most heavily researched, widely used psychological testing tools in the world. It consists of hundreds of true-false questions meticulously designed to identify psychopathology, things like paranoia, psychopathic deviance, depression, and schizophrenia.
It's the gold standard.
It is. It even has internal scales designed to catch people who are lying or trying to present themselves in a falsely positive light.
And yet, when researchers ran known sex offenders through this highly sophisticated test, it completely failed to find a consistent profile that discriminates them from normal adults.
They look just like everyone else on paper.
Exactly. The abusers didn't trigger a specific pattern of red flags. It is terrifying because it means the threat is perfectly camouflaged in everyday life.
It really is.
I mean, if top-tier psychologists can't even pin down a reliable profile on a clinical test explicitly designed to catch pathology, how on earth are schools or parents supposed to spot these predators at a PTA meeting?
They can't. It is the ultimate social camouflage. As Steele pointed out in the 1987 research Peterson cites, there is huge variety in offender preferences and methodologies.
Right.
Some target very young girls, some target adolescent boys, some are women seducing children. There is no one-size-fits-all personality type. However, Steele did note that while they don't share a single personality profile that triggers the MMPI, they do often share deep-seated historical and emotional symptoms with the physical abusers we discussed earlier.
Right. The underlying rot is often similar. Things like a severe lack of self-esteem, a poorly integrated sense of identity, deep social isolation, and a personal history of emotional deprivation or physical abuse in their own childhoods.
The cycle again.
Yeah. But here's the problem. You can't see a poorly integrated identity when someone kindly offers to coach the Little League team, or when an uncle offers to babysit.
Precisely. The external presentation is often incredibly normal, sometimes even charming. And because society collectively realized that we cannot reliably identify the abusers before they strike, we shifted our entire cultural strategy in the 1980s and 90s.
A massive shift.
If we couldn't spot the predators hiding in the grass, the logic was that we had to armor the prey. We tried to put the power of prevention into the hands of the children themselves.
Which takes us to the most shocking revelation in this entire deep dive. The prevention paradox.
Yes.
We realized the adults were failing, so we put the burden on the kids.
And to understand the colossal failure of this strategy, we first have to understand the clinical theory of prevention.
Okay. Walk us through it.
Peterson outlines 3 distinct levels. Primary prevention is stopping the abuse from ever happening in the first place, intervening with high-risk individuals before they cross the line.
So stopping the crime before it's a crime.
Right. Secondary prevention is treating a child immediately after they've been abused so they don't perpetuate the cycle in the next generation. Yes. And tertiary prevention is the after-the-fact systemic intervention to stop ongoing abuse from continuing.
Okay, and to achieve that holy grail of primary prevention, Peterson brings in Finkelhor's 1984 model.
This is key.
Because Finkelhor states that 4 specific preconditions must be met for abuse to actually occur.
4 steps.
First, the offender has to be psychologically motivated to do it. Second, they have to overcome their own internal moral inhibitions. They have to use cognitive distortions to tell themselves, it's okay the child wants this, or I'm just showing them affection.
They justify it to themselves. Third, they have to overcome external inhibitions. This is the grooming of the environment.
Finding the right time and place.
Exactly. They have to find a situation where they won't get caught, isolating the child from protective adults. And fourth, they have to overcome the resistance of the child. They use coercion, threats, or manipulation to ensure the child complies and stays silent.
Now, hold on to that 4th precondition.
Yeah.
Overcoming the resistance of the child. Because that concept became the focal point for an entire multi-million-dollar industry of school-based education.
It became the obsession. But before we get to the school programs, Peterson shows us a primary prevention program that actually worked.
Oh, right, the ADVANCE program.
Yes, the Advanced Parent-Child Education Program in San Antonio, Texas, which started in 1979. It targeted low-income, highly stressed mothers of young children. And the brilliance of ADVANCE is that it didn't just sit these mothers down and lecture them about not hitting their kids.
No, it addressed the roots of their stress. It offered free childcare, nutrition classes, group counseling, and intensive home visitations.
They even implemented toy-making classes.
Toy making. That sounds so simple.
It does, but think about the psychology of that. The parents would make toys and then watch their children play with them, while facilitators discussed what the child was learning developmentally.
Oh, I see.
Making a toy creates a shared, non-stressful goal. It forces the parent to observe the child as a developing organism that is learning, rather than viewing the child as a miniature adult who is maliciously defying them.
Building empathy.
Exactly. By treating the parent's environment, drastically reducing their isolation and building developmental empathy, Avance significantly improved parental attitudes toward punishment and reduced the severity of discipline.
It worked because it attacked the first three preconditions of abuse, right?
Yes.
The adult's motivation, their internal inhibitions, and their environmental stress. It treated the adult.
Because the adult is the source of the danger.
But here is the tragic reality that requires immense resources, time, and community investment. Schools generally don't have the budget to fix a parent's crushing poverty or social isolation.
They just don't.
So instead of treating the adults, schools turn to a cheaper, faster option. They focus entirely on Fickelhorst's fourth precondition. They try to teach the child how to resist.
And this is where we look at the monumental 1988 review by Theringer and her colleagues. They meticulously analyzed 41 different commercially available school-based sexual abuse prevention programs.
41 different programs.
Yes. These are the assemblies, the cartoon videos, and the curriculums that millions of kids went through.
And if you grew up in this era, you know these programs. They taught concepts like good touch versus bad touch. They taught body ownership, the idea that your body is your property and nobody else's.
Right.
They taught kids to trust their intuition, their uh-oh feeling. And above all, they taught kids empowerment. The core message drilled into these children was that if an adult makes an inappropriate advance, the child must take action. The child must loudly and clearly say no.
On the surface, in a sterile curriculum planning meeting, it sounds incredibly logical and deeply empowering.
Sounds great.
But when Theringer's team looked for the data to back it up, they found a bombshell.
Zero empirical evidence.
None. Theringer concluded there was no published research anywhere in sociological or psychological databases at the time, proving that empowering children with these specific skills actually prevented sexual abuse from occurring.
So what does this all mean? We built a massive educational infrastructure, rolled it out to millions of children on a completely untested theoretical assumption.
Yes.
And Peterson highlights the unintended, actually harmful consequences that Theringer uncovered. Because teaching a kindergartner to just say no to a manipulative, deeply trusted adult like an uncle or a coach is like giving a toddler a fire extinguisher and telling them it's their job to stop the house from burning down.
That's exactly what it is.
It's an impossible task. And if the house burns down, what does the toddler think? They think it's their fault.
The victim's self-blame is the most tragic, insidious consequence of these programs. When a child is abused, there is an immense, crushing power dynamic at play. The adult uses authority, coercion, threats to the family, or manipulation. The child's brain is often literally frozen in terror. Their fight-or-flight system simply shuts down into a freeze response.
They physically can't say no.
Exactly. And if that child has been taught by their trusted school that their explicit job was to say no and protect their body, and they failed to do so, they internalize the blame entirely.
Oh, that's horrific.
They think, my teacher taught me how to stop this. I knew the rules, and I didn't stop it. Therefore, I allowed it. It is my fault.
It weaponizes their own education against them. It adds a whole new layer of guilt to the trauma.
It does.
And the review found other negative consequences, too. Teaching these programs in total isolation from normal, healthy sex education or discussions of affection made children view all sexuality and all physical touch as inherently secretive and dangerous.
Which causes its own long-term issues.
Right. Furthermore, it completely overwhelmed the school staff. Teachers and guidance counselors were suddenly tasked with being frontline trauma counselors without any of the proper clinical support or resources.
This is why Theringer and her colleagues issued a stark, unequivocal warning. The goal of school-based programs should never be prevention by the child.
Never.
The burden of prevention belongs squarely on adults and society. The only acceptable goal of a school program aimed at kids should be disclosure and identification.
Meaning, we shouldn't be teaching them combat tactics to fight off an attacker. We should be giving them the vocabulary to tell a safe adult what happened after the fact.
Exactly.
The review suggested we need to redefine secrets for kids, teaching them the difference between a fun surprise secret, like a birthday party, and a dangerous secret that makes them feel bad and must be shared.
That's a crucial distinction for a child.
And we have to give them the actual biological names for their body parts. Because the review found that terms like good touch and bad touch were often way too confusing and abstract for young children to use when trying to make a disclosure to a police officer or a doctor.
It is a profound philosophical shift. You move from trying to make a child bulletproof, which is impossible, to simply giving them a functional radio to call for help.
I love that analogy, a functional radio.
But even if a school implements the perfect disclosure program, we run into the final, perhaps most insidious barrier Peterson outlines in the source. And that is the neurological reality of the traumatized child sitting in the classroom.
Right. Because if we accept that a child shouldn't be burdened with preventing their own abuse, how do we educate them at all?
It's the central problem for educators.
How can an abused child even process a lesson, whether it's about math, history, or safe secrets, when their brain is trapped in a perpetual state of survival?
Peterson applies cognitive information processing theory to explain this, and it is a fascinating way to look at education.
Okay, break that down for us.
Information processing theory gives us a structural map of how the human brain learns. Information first hits this sensory register. It's taking in everything around you, what you see, hear, smell, and touch.
The raw data.
Right. But the register only holds that raw data for a few milliseconds. If the brain decides the information is important, it passes it along to the short-term memory. And if it's processed and rehearsed well there, it finally gets encoded and stored in the long-term memory.
But the sensory register isn't just a passive microphone recording everything equally, is it?
No, not at all.
It has a filter.
Right.
And that filter is built by your past experiences, your fears, and your current mental state. This goes right back to Dr. Helfer's observation about sensory numbing, or the stamp folder analogy we used earlier.
Exactly the same mechanism.
If a child's sensory register is wired by trauma to associate a hand on the shoulder with a violent beating, what happens when a kind, well-meaning teacher puts a hand on their shoulder to point out a mistake on a math worksheet?
This raises an important question about the physical environment of the classroom itself. If the teacher happens to be the same gender as the child abuser, and they initiate that touch, the child's sensory register doesn't process the input as helpful math instruction.
Right.
The trauma filter categorizes it instantly as imminent physical threat. The cognitive system dumps the educational information entirely and triggers an autonomic survival response.
So they freeze or fight.
Yes. The child might dissociate, going completely blank, or they might become violently aggressive, flipping the desk. To the teacher, it looks like unprovoked defiance. To the child's brain, it is logical self-defense.
And it gets even worse when we look at the next step, the short-term memory.
Yes.
The short-term memory has very limited space. It's your working memory. Peterson explains that if a child is sitting at their desk, but their mind is actively ruminating on the threats they heard at home that morning, or the fear of what will happen when the bell rings, their short-term memory is entirely occupied.
It is the definition of cognitive interference. The skills that keep a child alive in an abusive home, hypervigilance, emotional detachment, constantly scanning the room for danger, are the exact opposite of the cognitive skills required to learn in a classroom.
Right.
Learning requires relaxed focus, trusting your environment, and opening your mind to absorb new, complex concepts.
I picture it like trying to download a massive, complex software update on a computer that has a critical virus running in the background.
Perfect analogy.
The virus is eating up 99% of the RAM. The hardware is fine. The kid is incredibly smart. But the system is overloaded. There is literally no cognitive space left to process a lesson on fractions, let alone a nuanced, highly complex, emotional lesson on redefining what a secret is.
And this is where Peterson brings in Albert Bandura's social learning theory to offer a path forward.
Okay, what does Bandura suggest?
Bandura emphasizes that humans learn primarily through modeling, not just direct instruction. If a child's cognitive system is overloaded by trauma, traditional lecturing will fail. But the consistent observable behavior of the adults in the school environment can slowly bypass that overloaded system.
It's about teachers modeling nonviolence. Peterson uses a great example of this in the text. Say a child is acting out or didn't do their homework.
Right.
The teacher could get angry, rip up the paper, raise their voice, and throw the paper away. That reaction instantly reinforces the child's internal social script that frustration always equals violence and chaos.
It confirms their worst fears.
Yeah, but if the teacher models an assertive, calm response, saying, "I'm disappointed this isn't done, but let's figure out together how to solve this," they are actively rewriting the child's fundamental understanding of how the world works.
They're providing a living, breathing counter-narrative to the cycle of violence we discussed earlier with Strauss and Cantor. Every calm, measured interaction is a subtle neurological intervention. It teaches the child that adults can experience frustration without resorting to abuse.
If you're an educator listening to this, think about the kid in your second row who falls asleep every day, or the kid who lashes out at the slightest correction. Your instinct, trained by the system, is to discipline them, or maybe test them for a learning disability.
Which is standard protocol.
Right. But understanding this cognitive overload forces you to question the entire structure of our educational system. How can standardized testing, or traditional schooling metrics, ever fairly assess a child who's carrying this invisible, crushing cognitive load?
They simply can't. Not without deeply acknowledging the context of the child's life, and that is ultimately the core demand of Peterson's paper. We have to see the context. We have to stop looking at behaviors in a vacuum.
We've covered a tremendous amount of ground today, from the staggering statistics of the NIS studies that showed over 1 million children in danger, and the realization that shifting bureaucratic definitions can either mask or reveal the true scope of the crisis.
Yeah, that elastic ruler.
We looked at the tragic competition for nurturance, where broken, socially scripted adults demand that children become the parents, lashing out with violence when the kids inevitably fail.
We examined the heavily camouflaged nature of sexual abuse, the failure of the MMPI to find a reliable psychological profile for offenders, and the deeply paradoxical reality that the very school programs designed to empower children may have inadvertently burdened them with the agonizing guilt of their own victimization.
To you listening right now, whether you're a parent, an educator, or just someone who interacts with children in your community, understanding these dynamics shifts your perspective permanently.
It really does.
It changes how you view a child. It forces you to question the efficacy of well-meaning but unproven school assemblies. It makes you realize that true prevention is, and always will be, an adult responsibility. We can't outsource our protection to the kids.
And if we look back at the cognitive processing data, it leaves us with a highly provocative thought regarding how we treat children in modern society.
Well, let's hear it.
We know from the clinical data that abused children develop hypervigilance, severe distraction, and sometimes hyperactive aggression as necessary, life-saving survival mechanisms.
Right.
It leaves you wondering, in our modern, frantic rush to diagnose children with behavioral or learning disorders like ADHD in the classroom, how often are we actually just medicating a child's perfectly logical cognitive adaptation to an abusive home life?
Are we just looking at a broken X-ray machine and diagnosing the wrong disease entirely? It's a question that demands an answer. Thank you for joining us on this intense but vital deep dive into the sources. Keep questioning the data, keep looking for the context around you, and take care of each other.